I'm really happy to be back here and to let people know more about, to share what I've learned about one of the most influential women in the city of Monterey, or in the county really of Monterey, who is somewhat ignored today. I first became interested in Margaret Jacks when I was looking at the Memory Garden, and I heard that she had had it built and that it was designed by the Olmsted brothers. So I did further research and found out not only a lot about the garden, but a lot more about her activities and how important she was for such a long period of time. This picture, by the way, is of the Memory Garden, at the height of the flowers. Margaret really stands out for a number of reasons among philanthropists. One is that she was visionary, looking at broad plans, but also very down to earth. She was a real hands-on person in many ways. The picture here is from an early Merienda festival. It's the only, I've not found very many photos of her. I have some of her as a very young girl and of a very old woman. But this is from the 30s, one of the early Merienda festivals. She's also had, her interest ranged from children's and youth activities, the military YMCA, planning, urban planning, parks planning, to historic preservation. So she was just a very wide range of interests. And she was in them for the long term. With the Red Cross, she actually participated for 60 years. They said they didn't have a button to recognize that level of service. She is well known for her property donations, and they were often very targeted. She knew what she wanted to donate and why, and wanted to often leverage more money to get people to add to the donations. And of course, like most philanthropists, she had large bequests when she died. We obviously need to start out with where her money came from. So David Jacks, who is one of the most well-known figures in Monterey County history, emigrated from Scotland at the age of 19, and he came to Monterey about 1850. He learned quickly that the way to make money during the period of the gold rush was in commerce and land. He started out very poor, working at the Boston store, but leveraged his money and bought in various ways. He acquired, which is a whole different topic, but he acquired ranchos all the way down to Soledad. As you can see, it was very broad and broad-based. He owned most of this area, the Monterey area, but also farmland and dairyland throughout the valley. And this was the real source of his income and the main part of what the children eventually inherited with this farmland here. This is the Jacks house, which is not often seen. This is actually a postcard on the Monterey History and Art website. The house that they lived in was at the north end of Van Buren Street, above Pacific, so it looked out over the bay. It was on a 3-acre parcel of land. After Jacks died, his son Will Jacks inherited this property. And when he died in 1937, it was left to the Shriners, who sold it for money. So it's now all subdivided. It's across the street from where the Mayo Hayes O'Donnell Library is today. So you can see how it's all newer houses in that area. Will, in an interview, expressed the family philosophy. And I don't know how much they actually talked about this, but it's something that obviously the family followed up on, is that because they were so fortunate, it was each of them had the obligation to make the world better. I really wish this house were still here. We don't really have anything like that anymore, I think. When I was putting together this information, I was really stunned by this. So I saw this bit by bit as I looked at each person, then put it all in one slide. The Jacks family had 5 daughters and 2 sons, and they were extraordinarily well educated, as you can see. Jacks himself didn't go to college. He had gone to the village school in Portland, in Scotland, but he married Mary Romy Jacks, who was a teacher. She was from Mexico. She'd been born in Mexico, but her parents were German immigrants. So she was fluent in 3 languages, and she studied, I believe, at the University of the Pacific. One thing I want to clarify about this slide is that I am mostly using the current names of the colleges. What we now call UOP is in Stockton, but it was originally in Santa Clara, and it was called California Wesleyan, which is what it would have been when these people went there. You also note that most of the education is on the East Coast. It'd be interesting somehow to know why they went to Cornell. I mean, perhaps Will went there first and then Janet followed. Janet graduated from UOP and then went to Cornell as a graduate student in engineering. So that's very interesting. And Margaret started out here in Oakland, where Vida did, but then she went to Boston Girls Latin, presumably because her sister was there at the time, or in her brother, because you see they were all in Boston at one point. But she also ended up graduating from Cornell. So it's just, you know, looking at this, you just really wonder, like, how did Romy end up at Lawrenceville, you know? By the way, Davis, I found this quite interesting. When he went to Davis, it was basically an agricultural station. It wasn't part of the university yet, as far as I can tell, but he would have studied agriculture there. That makes a lot of sense given the amount of farmland they owned, but I don't know if he was actually involved in the farm management here. The first major thing we know that Margaret did was to establish a chapter of the Red Cross in 1898, when she was only 24. She did this with Lou Henry, who was a neighbor and very close family friend. She was trained as a teacher and was the tutor for Vida, the youngest daughter. The Red Cross chapter did the normal things you expect. They raised relief money and took care of refugees after the San Francisco fire. During World War I, they knitted socks and made jackets and bandages, pretty much what you would expect of a chapter at this time. But what is most interesting is that in 1912, the Red Cross set up a rural nursing service, basically fulfilling public health functions. So Margaret became very involved in this. And this is probably the most common picture you see of her in her nursing uniform. So she spent some time, I don't know how many years she did this. They operated through the Depression in this way. And she was, going throughout the county, helping people in need, visiting people who had nursing needs. I don't know, for instance, what training she had or anything about this. Again, this whole idea of the nursing service in the county is something that would be really interesting to find out more about when the archives are open. One of Margaret's big passions was community planning, and especially beautification. She was on the planning commission for 25 years, which deserves some sort of medal. Most people are glad to leave after their first 3, knowing I speak from experience there. And the plan that came out in 1939 was very unusual for a city to have such a comprehensive plan. 2 of the main goals are things that really speak to Margaret's passions. One was to preserve and restore the historic buildings. And when we talk about historic buildings at this point in 1939, and really throughout Margaret's period, we mean the historic buildings, for the Adobe buildings from the 19th century. That's really what was being focused on, and also to protect historic views in open space. So this is an important document, which I believe is available online, but it's very interesting to read. This is a fun postcard that happens to be from the same year that the plan was published. And you can see here how the development at this point was really focused right along the edge of the bay here. And out most of Pacific Grove is still undeveloped here. There's a large property for the hotel and its golf course here. And then Pebble Beach has hardly any development. The golf links are here, but there are not very many houses in this whole area. This area here, which I'll talk about quite a bit more later, was owned by the family called Rancho Aguajito. So it's really centrally located, as you can see, and was really the major part of their properties here in Monterey. It's not very often that a planning commissioner has the means to actually go out and implement the plan. But in a lot of senses, that is what Margaret did. They donated Dondavi Park here, and I have another map that shows this as well. Dondavi Park is a very narrow park along Munris here before you get to Del Monte Center. And then near the college, there's the Irish Canyon Wilderness here. And then this is El Estero, of course, we know that, which they owned and donated. I'm not clear exactly which parts of this they owned at this time. And then Washerwoman's Bay, which is not very well known, is up here toward Monterey Peninsula College. It's sort of like covered by roadways now. Margaret also donated money to leverage money to build Friendly Plaza at Colton Hall. The family is well known for obviously Jacks Ballpark and the nearby Sports Center land and Jacks Peak Park, which sort of raises an interesting point is, as I said, when the corporation, the David Jacks Corporation, was dissolved in 1919, the properties were divvied up among the siblings. So actually following the ownership of each one is sort of complicated and perhaps not very important, but the ballpark land was actually belonged to Mary Jacks. What makes it more confusing is that some of the people, especially the two unmarried sisters, when they died, they left their properties in trust to Margaret, and then it was not distributed till after her death in 1962. So it's just, if one is interested in following the actual ownership, it gets very confusing. So the major project that the sisters had in Monterey, which again, I don't think is well known, is the Alta Mesa neighborhood. Now, they owned, as I showed you on the map, Rancho Aguajito, which is this whole area here. And this part outlined in black is what is now called the Alta Mesa neighborhood. And it has, this is Munris here, and then Fremont here, and then the college over here. So the sisters, who had a company called LM&V Jacks, hired the Olmsted brothers to do a master plan for this whole area, much larger than Alta Mesa. There's very extensive documentation on this, and about, I think, 80 plans and documents on this. The plan was completed in 1927. The plan included not just the residential areas that we know today, but there were spaces for commercial development, hotels, schools, things like that included in the plan. Then the sisters themselves subdivided a few areas and sold lots. During the planning of this, the discussion with the Olmsted brothers, there was a lot of talk about the value of the property. So they always intended to sell it, and they wanted to know how they could get the best value. For obviously, they were, business people as well as philanthropists. So there's a lot of talk about that. And it was from the discussions with the Olmsteds that the idea of making this a park, Don Davie Park, came about, and also the fact that Iris Canyon is pretty much unbuildable, so that they decided that they would donate those spaces to the park, to the city. Now, at that time, the city did not really have a parks commission, and a few years later, the Olmsted brothers were hired by the city to do a citywide parks plan. And I've not studied that plan yet. That's something I would like to do in the future when I have more access to city records. Throughout this area, again, it's interesting because when you read the correspondence on this project, there is a lot of discussion about property owned by Will and property owned by Mary. And, so it's, again, very confusing to figure out exactly what was what. Perhaps Margaret's major interest was preserving Monterey heritage. And this really refers back to the idea of the Spanish and Californio era, the adobes and the general atmosphere and artworks of that era. She was one of the founders of the Monterey History and Art Association in 1931. As a matter of fact, in reading the correspondence, which is on the Memory Garden, which it has fascinating correspondence on that, it seems to me that the idea for this association and for La Merienda came about through her discussions with the designer of the garden, that the letters seem to indicate that he brought up these ideas and she adopted them. So Monterey History and Art was founded in 1931, and about that same time they started La Merienda, which is the annual birthday party for Monterey, held in June every year, except last year. And another part of that was that the History and Art had an annual Adobe tour in the summer, not the Christmas tour that now exists. It became very elaborate. It's really fascinating on the Monterey History and Art website to look at how elaborate these tours got. There were more and more houses included. There are luncheons, band concerts, all sorts of things. But one thing that was always there throughout her lifetime was the Castro Adobe was featured, Miss Jacks' own Adobe. Also in 1945, she was one of the founders of the Monterey Foundation, which is now the Community Foundation. And I think it's not well known, at least I didn't know it until I looked into the history, is that the Monterey Foundation was originally founded by Monterey History and Art members with the purpose of buying and restoring adobes and getting good owners for them. So that's a real interesting tie-in there. So I mentioned that one of her homes was the Castro Adobe. There are many Castro Adobes. You probably know the one in San Juan Bautista. There are a lot of Castro Adobes. This one is a pretty modest one, and it's right up next to the Del Monte golf course. So this was part of the properties. She didn't buy this. This was part of the properties that they inherited. And she restored it and used it as her Monterey house. she designed about the same time that she was working on the Rancho Aguajito and the Memory Garden. She designed the Olmsted brothers to do a layout. So this is pretty well documented as well, that, you know, they drew plans for an addition and a detached garage and a forecourt and, you know, driveways throughout and planting beds. I don't think they actually did garden planning here. So this building actually still exists. A more current picture is on the right, but it's been totally, they're new buildings. It's been subdivided, and then they're new buildings, additions, so you can't really tell much. And I don't think, it's hard to see, but I don't think much of the Olmsted design exists. That's pretty common for the endless number of estates that the Olmsteds did, that they get altered fairly quickly. So as I mentioned, the three unmarried sisters set up their own company in 1919. And one project was Rancho Aguajito. I think they also were involved in the farmlands. I know that Lee, one of the sisters, was very involved in getting irrigation added to much of the farmland in the Salinas Valley. But here in Monterey, what we know the company for really is restoring and donating historic buildings. The picture here is of the Boston store. This is the store that David Jacks worked at when he first came to Monterey. It's called Casa del Oro because this is where miners would store their gold when they came into town. It is now, it was donated to the state and is now a shop for the Historic Garden League. Will Jacks owned this at one point. Again, the ownership gets confusing here and probably is not important. But when Will Jacks owned it, he actually converted it to a residence, which was probably for rent. I mean, obviously he had that big house just 2 blocks away. He didn't need to live here. But so when the state got it, they converted it back to a store. And that's what it remains today. Another property that they have rather far away is in Soledad, the Los Coches Adobe. That is now owned by the city of Soledad. I'm not sure who they donated it to start with, but it's still there, needing restoration badly, but it was one of their things they donated. So the Jacks Company's major projects here in Monterey were the Old Pacific Building and the Memory Garden. However, in reading the correspondence on the Memory Garden, this is the only place I was able to find anything about really what Margaret thought. There are archives at Stanford, which consists almost entirely of David Jacks's business papers. And then there are a few business papers from Margaret, you know, basically property, records, deeds, things like that. So this, to me, is really the best example of how she felt about things, especially this building. So what she says is that what she really wants to do is to prove that one of the adobes can be commercially successful and that we don't need to tear them down to build uninteresting concrete buildings. Of course, those uninteresting buildings are the ones on Alvarado that we now call historic, but that's the way history is. She also knows that she wants to try to earn money here by having a tea garden when the time is ripe. We'll talk about that in a minute. And she always saw it as a place for community. See, she says that they could have community concerts there. So she saw this as an important asset for the city of Monterey and something for the community to use in the long term. Her sister, now she sort of seems a little bit wishy-washy, I think, about the commercial aspects here, saying it probably can be used as a tea garden someday. But Lee, her sister, was always against this project. She never felt that it would be commercially successful and didn't think it was a worthwhile expenditure of money. Since she was a partner, she reviewed all the plans and commented on them. And what happened is the designer of the plans was named Arnold Stoughton, and he wrote letters every week back to the Olmsted firm that was then located in Redondo Beach, California. And he was very frank in his discussions of his interactions with Margaret and Lee, and how Lee would try to stop everything. But eventually he could persuade Margaret by appealing to her sense of beauty. That's what he said. So in the end, Margaret was correct. It was never a commercially viable project, but it obviously, the money spent was worthwhile in the long run. Because when she wrote that, this is what she had. The Old Pacific Building, and it was always from the very beginning called the Old Pacific Building. It was only about 50 years old at the time, or even 40 years old when they started calling it that. So this is a building that David Jacks purchased in the 1880s. And he did restoration, but by the 1920s, it was pretty much derelict. There were not many uses here. I think that at this point, there may have been a curio shop and the YMCA. During his lifetime, they actually had Presbyterian church services on the second floor. So the building was pretty run down and wasn't producing much income. The rear yard, as you can see, was pretty dramatically awful. It had never really been improved and was used mostly for storage. Also, the wall that enclosed, the Adobe wall around the garden was pretty much collapsed. The idea of a tea garden sort of is funny, and she sort of wavers on this. This neighborhood on the waterfront, right near the Custom House, was deteriorating at that time. With Prohibition, a lot of they said, I've read that a lot of the alcohol-related activities sort of migrated down to the waterfront, where they thought there would be less enforcement. There was also a major oil tank fire nearby, which you might have heard of. It was really not very far from this building and the Custom House. And during the 20s, there were some severe storms that damaged the wharf and other buildings. So there was really not much happening commercially and in this area, and it's not necessarily really a place that someone would go to have tea. But this is what she had at the end of the project. This building was all restored, and then this had been a service area. This building was built, the annex building it's called, with compatible Spanish styling that goes really well with the other building. So this had another curio shop here. This sign says Mexican Idol Shop, which is pretty weird. And then their offices were upstairs. The LM&V Jacks offices were upstairs. This is a garage building that was actually built at the same time, but had no connection with them. I'd like to show these old photos, which show how this building fit into its context before the Custom House Plaza was built. I mean, it really gives you a different view of this building, a different idea of its context. So the Memory Garden, sort of really a centerpiece for downtown Monterey. They hired the Olmsted brothers in 1924, and it was at that time that correspondence about her vision was made. This building, this drawing here, I think is a really nice rendering of her original vision. And what we see here, we can identify, whenever I move we can identify the big open space with the trees at the edge. And this open space was left there because they wanted to have the band concerts there. Then north of that is the tea garden, which has these red awnings. That was the vision, that it would be sheltered by red awnings. Then at the end, there's a big wall fountain here. So this, about a year and a half later, this is the plan that we see today. The trees have been brought in, and these are magnolias, as you probably know. And then there's an octagonal fountain in the middle instead of the band area. Now, this is sort of interesting because there was no water there to start with, whereas the idea was that there would be a Spanish garden, and really a Spanish garden needs a fountain. It's really important in that type of garden. There was at one point the idea of having a large pool and garden here and wall fountain here, but that didn't last very long. Also, the entire area is rimmed by pergolas, as it is today. Then we see at the tea garden, we have the wall fountain is moved over to the side where it is now. And then at the back is an outdoor kitchen, which is very interesting. I don't know how many people are even aware that it's there, but there's a grill in the middle and then storage areas built right into the wall on each side, and workspaces. I mean, it's really a total kitchen of that period that you can really see being used for some sort of catering event here. I've often gotten questions about this fountain. I don't believe that this figure has any particular meaning. There was a mention in the records of buying garden ornaments from a company called Francis Howard in New York, but I don't know if that's where this came from or not. But I don't think it has any particular meaning. It's never discussed in the correspondence. This, however, is different. This is the wall fountain in the tea garden, and I know it's a little hard to see, but what we have here is, so this shows the side view of this, and so it was supposed to come up and have a little roof there. What we have here is a female figure rising out of a shell, supported by what looks to me like a column of kelp. I think that nobody really liked this. I think that people thought that Stoughton was basically an artist and designer. And I think people thought that he was getting carried away here. And this fountain was the last part of the project done. And so clearly they said at this point, let's just build a fountain and not do this nonsense. So the tile used here is from American Encaustic, which is a major tile manufacturer in Ohio. I find it interesting that they didn't use local tile like Malibu or Catalina tile. I'm not sure that's an important thing. It was purchased through a wholesaler in Los Angeles. And these tiles, the gold tiles, were losing their color even while they were being installed. So they had to totally reorder the tile even while it was under construction. This, as I said, was toward the end of the project. Mr. Stoughton was from San Diego. He had been hired for this project. And at the end, before the fountains were finished, he actually moved back to San Diego, where he became an artist again. There's a lot of discussion in the correspondence about hiring people to do the labor and how they felt, or Stoughton felt, I guess I should say, that it was really hard to get enough good labor in Monterey, that people didn't seem to want to work very quickly. So this is interesting photo of the memory garden. So on the left, you can see the barbecue, which as far as I can determine was installed about 1939. They'd been having meriendas every year. And you can see in the back, the kitchen. And next time you're there, sort of check this out. It's really a sort of cute little place. And, but I think that the installation of this grill sort of is the final word, that this is not a tea garden anymore. You know, it's really for large events. And so this is a picture of the setup for La Merienda in the 1960s. And again, I like this because it shows the buildings to the rear that were most of which were demolished shortly after this photo was taken. But you can sort of see how the trees have grown up. And what's really noticeable is that vines are the major landscaping feature here that are visible there. So this is a picture of Margaret at the end of her life. There's several pictures of her at Merienda late in her life. So this would have been, she died in 62. So this is probably about 1960. It was her custom to every year to buy the birthday cake that's brought in during the Merienda. And here she's being handed the sword to cut it with. So I'm not sure if she's going to actually cut it or somebody else is, but that was the custom. I mean, still the custom, obviously she doesn't do it. But another interesting thing I discovered, maybe other people, everybody knew this, but she actually moved to Palo Alto in 1943. She did not actually live here, even though she continued to be very active in Monterey affairs. And she did own the Castro Adobe as one of her houses, but she was actually living in Palo Alto. I don't know why she moved to Palo Alto, but Lou Henry, who you may have figured out, married Herbert Hoover. And so after they left the White House, they did live for a while back at Stanford during the time that their the Hoover Institution was being set up. So Lou was, I think, based on what I can read, living in Palo Alto when Margaret moved there, but she died the following year. The family, the whole Jacks family was pretty peripatetic. I don't think any of them actually lived here most of the time. Janet, who was an engineer, she married an electrical engineer, and they became extremely wealthy from the work in the electric power industry in the West Coast. So they lived in LA. Lee and Vide, I think, lived in San Francisco. So they just lived all over the place. So when Margaret died, her estate exceeded $7 million. And $6 million of that went to Stanford, basically the farmland in the Salinas Valley. She also left a lot of farmland to people who were farming it at that point or running dairies at that point. There's several bequests to individuals on the farmland. The other sisters also left money to Stanford, and I think that they gave about $10 million to Stanford in total. And this $6 million was the largest bequest that Stanford had received to that time, other than obviously the original Stanford bequest. And again, I don't know it's well known, but there's actually on the main quad there at Stanford, a Margaret Jacks Hall. And there are several endowed professorships in education. One thing I found when I first started doing this is that there is not much information on Margaret Jacks at Stanford. What I found was a student paper she wrote the paper because she had no information on Margaret Jacks. And as I said, the Stanford archives do not have much on her either. So I wanted to talk about the sources because it was really important about how I could focus this talk, Mayo Hayes O'Donnell Library has a tremendous amount of information on the Jacks family, also postcards, photos, and information on other families. And a lot of that is online, which is really great. So during this period, it was hard to do some of this research. I had started it before the COVID shutdown, fortunately. And so that's where I was able to go to the State Parks District Office to read all the Olmsted correspondence regarding the garden. And that was just priceless. I mean, that should be published. The Historic Garden League has some great photos. One thing that everyone should know is that Olmsted Online has a tremendous amount of their projects online. For the past, I don't know, 15 years or so, people throughout the country have been working on putting the Olmsted plans and correspondence online for projects throughout the whole country. And it's very easily usable and searchable. A lot of the information is on the Library of Congress website, but everything is linked together. So if you ever want to know about anyone who, whether they had a project in this area or that area or something, that's a really great source. As I said, I was able to use the Stanford archives before the shutdown, but the one thing that didn't shut down was the historic newspapers, so I had to rely a lot on those. There was coverage of the Jacks family in San Francisco papers, as well as Salinas and Monterey. So that was really what filled in a lot of gaps. But of course, newspaper articles are sort of anecdotal. I mean, it's hard to get a broad history from them. And of course, the obituaries were very important, that most of the obituaries and records of their bequests were very helpful.